ये क्या कर रहे हैं आप?
ऐसी बेचारी का नाटक बंद कर मेरी कुतिया। तुझे तो तेरी शादी से पहले पेलते आया हूँ। यहाँ तक कि
रूही भी हम दोनों के रास लीला का नतीजा है।
जब से यहाँ आया हूँ तब से ठीक से करने नहीं मिला। आ जाओ मेरे पास, साथ में रक्षाबंधन मनाते हैं।
रक्षाबंधन मनाने के लिए हम दोनों कौन सा भाई बहन हैं?
अरे पग पग बंद कर मेरी कुतिया, मेरा फड़फड़ा रहा है तेरे अंदर जाने के लिए।
लेकिन नीचे शोक सभा।
5-10 मिनट का ही तो काम है।
चलो ठीक है, लेकिन सुनो, आज कॉन्डम नहीं है तो पीछे से ही निकालना। मुझे इस उम्र में और प्रेग्नेंट नहीं होना।
मुझे कुछ जरूरी बात करनी है आप सब लोगों से। मालिनी जी और गिरीश जी नजर नहीं आ रहे।
जी मैं उन्हें बुला के लेके आती हूँ।
ठीक है।
मामा, माँ, आप दोनों अंदर कर क्या रहे हो?
ये हमेशा कबाब में हड्डी बनती है। तुम्हारी मम्मी की साड़ी में ना कुछ गिर गया है तो वो डायरेक्टली अपने कमरे से नीचे आ जाएंगी।
ठीक है, जो करना है जल्दी करो। नीचे मैनेजर साहब भी आ गए हैं, उनको ना कुछ इम्पोर्टेंट बात करनी है, जल्दी आना।
ये हमेशा इम्पोर्टेंट बात एंड में कहती है।
जैसा कि आप सब लोग अब हॉल में आ ही चुके हैं, तो आज मैं आपको एक खुशी की बात बताने वाला हूँ। खुशी की बात? हाँ, पुलिस को जंगल में एक लड़का मिला है। उस लड़के का चेहरा हमारे नील बाबा के बचपन के फोटो से मिलता जुलता है। बस पुलिस उसको लेकर आ ही रही है। लीजिए, पुलिस आ रही है।
हम चाहते हैं आप जल्दी से जल्दी शिनाख्त कर लीजिए। रिपोर्ट के हिसाब से इनके गुप्तांग पे कोई तो बर्थ मार्क था, तो आप में से जो कोई भी इस बर्थ मार्क के बारे में जानता हो बस एक बार चेक कर लीजिए।
भैया, भाभी ने बचपन से नहलाया है इनको पता ही होगा ना।
आप जल्दी शिनाख्त कीजिए।
जी इंस्पेक्टर, मैं देखती हूँ। बेटा मैं हूँ। यही नील बेटा है।
चलिए मधुकर जी, हमारा काम खत्म हुआ।
थैंक यू सो मच इंस्पेक्टर साहब। आइए हम आपको बाहर तक छोड़ के आते हैं।
छी, कितना गंदा है ये।
क्या तुम नील को उसके कमरे तक ले जा सकती हो?
हाँ ठीक है। चलो बेटा चलो इस तरफ।
अरे तुमने ये क्या कर दिया? तुम्हें उसे पहचानने से मना कर देना चाहिए था कि ये नील है।
अगर मैं मना कर देती वो बाकी के रिश्तेदारों को भी सीनात ले जाते, और जितना ज्यादा लोग आ जाएंगे उतना ज्यादा कंपटीशन बढ़ जाएगा। नील ना समझ अभी, उसको हम कैसे भी ढेला फुसला के उसकी पूरी प्रॉपर्टी हमारे नाम कर सकते हैं।
ओके, ये बात मेरे दिमाग में क्यों नहीं आई है?
क्योंकि दिमाग चलाने का काम मेरा है।
कुछ कहा तुम्हें?
नहीं।
तुम एक काम करो, पहले जाके नील को नहला दो। जब से वो इस घर में आया है तब से एक खतरनाक गंध सी फैल गई है।
मेरी भी सांसें फूल रही है।
तो देख क्या रही हूँ, जाके उसे नहलाओ।
ठीक है, उसके कमरे में जाके मैं उसको नहला के लेके आती हूँ।
हाँ।
Jerome Powell stepped to the podium and the room stopped breathing. Cameras clicked like distant thunder, red lights blinking as if they already knew something the rest of the country didn't. Markets froze mid-sentence, traders stared at screens, anchors leaned forward. In that suspended second, America waited for a man who does not raise his voice to decide the temperature of an entire economy. Powell didn't rush. He didn't smile. He adjusted his papers with the calm of someone who understands that panic is contagious and composure is power. One eyebrow lift, one measured inhale. Social media exploded before he even spoke. Clips looped. Screenshots flew. "Read his face," people typed. "This is bad," others warned. Every pause became prophecy. Breaking news banners crawled across the screen, each one louder than the last. Interest rate decision. Fed chair speaks live. Trump-aligned voices flooded timelines within seconds, accusing, predicting, demanding. Some called him weak, others called him dangerous. A few went further, insisting this moment would expose who the Federal Reserve truly serves. Their certainty traveled faster than facts ever could. This wasn't just another policy update. Rent checks, grocery bills, student loans, and immigrant family savings accounts all hung invisibly in the air. Millions who would never read an FOMC statement still felt the weight of this silence. They knew, instinctively, that one sentence could ripple through kitchens, factories, border towns, and neighborhoods built by people who learned long ago what instability costs. Powell finally leaned toward the microphone, and the room tightened. Futures twitched. Commentators stopped talking mid-word. For a split second, it felt like the country itself was holding its breath, bracing for reassurance or rupture. Because buried beneath the jargon and the charts was a far more dangerous question, one no headline dared ask out loud. As Powell prepared to speak, few realized this wasn't just about interest rates at all. It was about power, pressure, and whether America's economic future is steered by steady hands or by the loudest voices in the room. And as that realization crept in, viewers sensed history bending slightly, realizing this pause would define trust, independence, and whose lives are protected when politics collides with the fragile promise of stability for millions watching from the margins, who rarely get second chances. This meeting mattered more than any spreadsheet could explain. Inflation wasn't an abstract term anymore. It was a feeling people carried into grocery stores, into rent negotiations, into late-night conversations about whether they could afford to stay where they had built their lives. Prices rose faster than wages, and the anxiety settled hardest on working families, immigrants, and first-generation Americans who had already learned how quickly stability can vanish. For them, economic turbulence wasn't theory, it was memory. An election year only sharpened the edge. Every decision now echoed beyond markets and into ballots, narratives, and national identity. The Federal Reserve, once a quiet institution most people ignored, was suddenly dragged into a cultural crossfire. Some demanded speed, relief, and instant comfort. Others warned that rushing would ignite a deeper fire. And in the middle stood Jerome Powell, tasked with choosing patience in a country addicted to immediacy. Hovering just outside the frame was Kevin Warsh, a name spoken with reverence in some circles and suspicion in others. To his supporters, he represented discipline, orthodoxy, and a return to tighter control. To critics, he symbolized an older economic order, less forgiving, less aware of who absorbs the pain when policy hardens. Warsh didn't need to be in the room to be present. His philosophy lingered like an alternative ending, one powerful voices seemed eager to test. And then there was the pressure no one could formally trace. No official statements, no direct commands, just a constant hum of expectation radiating from political power centers that had never hidden their frustration with an independent Fed. The message traveled without fingerprints. Growth now, relief now, loyalty now. Independence, once celebrated as a democratic safeguard, was reframed by critics as arrogance or obstruction. For millions watching, especially those whose families crossed oceans or borders chasing economic dignity, this tension felt painfully familiar. They understood what happens when institutions bend to strongmen, when expertise is mocked, when long-term stability is sacrificed for short-term applause. They had seen currencies collapse, savings evaporate, futures rewritten overnight. That history made this moment feel personal. It reminded them that economic decisions are never neutral, and that silence from power can be as loud as any speech. It also reminded them how quickly hard-earned progress can be reversed when politics overrides principle, leaving ordinary people to absorb the consequences alone. Viewers sensed that this was a crossroads moment where technocratic language masked moral consequence, and where the outcome would quietly signal who is protected during uncertainty and who is expected to endure the longest wait for relief in America today itself. History was quietly watching too. What Powell said next wouldn't just adjust rates, it would signal whether America still believes in guardrails, or whether every institution must kneel before political impatience. It would tell immigrants, workers, and young families whether the system values endurance over spectacle, responsibility over rage. The stakes were no longer measured in basis points, but in trust. Because once independence is surrendered, it is rarely handed back. And as the cameras stayed locked on Powell's face, one truth settled in. This decision would either steady a fragile nation or confirm fears that even the last neutral referee could be pulled into the fight. To understand why this moment felt so explosive, though, you had to understand the man critics say lost control long ago.
President Trump said Iran is engaging in serious discussions with U.S. officials to try to avert military escalation over nuclear programs, an indication of diplomatic efforts amid heightened tensions in the Gulf. Expanded national security moves. The White House recently issued an executive order addressing perceived threats from Cuba, including the framework for imposing new tariffs targeting nations that provide oil to Cuba, under national security justifications. Trump's tariff strategy receives domestic and economic emphasis. Trump continues to defend his tariff policies as drivers of economic growth and strengthening American industries, framing them as central to economic strategy despite some criticism. Domestic politics and governance. Proposed major Washington Monument project. Trump has supported plans for a gigantic triumphal arch in Washington, D.C., intended to symbolize national strength, though critics say it's out of scale with existing historic memorials. Federal Reserve leadership nomination. Trump is set to announce his nominee for the next Federal Reserve chair, a significant move in monetary policy direction ahead of midterms. Public confidence in Trump dipping. A recent Pew Research Center survey shows declining public confidence in Trump's leadership and his policies, especially among Republicans, with fewer Americans now supporting most of his agenda than a year ago. Immigration policy and civil unrest. Nationwide protests and strikes against immigration enforcement. Major protests, including no work, no school, no shopping strikes, have erupted across the U.S. in opposition to Trump's intensified immigration crackdown. Federal position on protests in Democratic-led cities. Trump announced federal forces will not intervene in protests in cities run by Democratic officials unless those local governments specifically request assistance. Cultural and business backlash. Trump's immigration policy has spurred a broad cultural revolt, with criticism from business leaders, politicians, athletes, and artists alike, raising political pressure during his second term. Tactical shift in enforcement after fatal shootings in Minnesota. Trump said he will de-escalate enforcement in the state and adjust operations, indicating a tactical shift, though not necessarily a policy reversal. Major strikes in Minnesota tied to deportations and raids. Major-scale collective action, including general strikes, have taken place in Minnesota under what's known as Operation Metro Surge.